Chapter 34. The Bleaklands Massacre. William was looking down at his arms, tensing his muscles and flexing his hands, staring down curiously as though assessing his own body for the first time. He could feel the power of the monster coursing through his chest, healing him and repairing his body into a state that it could better puppeteer. "Well, you've done it. But you need to get those wounds looked at," said August. William snapped his head up and tilted it, looking at August and Cain curiously. He pulled his sword out of the moor-crawler with his right hand before walking directly towards them, now holding two weapons. "William," said August, readying his sword, once more feeling that animalistic killing intent from the boy. William ignored him, continuing closer, his expression darkening back to that sadistic visage of war that August had seen behind his eyes before. "Hey!" exclaimed August, watching as William continued to close the gap between them, his pace growing by the moment. Cain looked between William and August searchingly, clearly not sure of why William was suddenly turning on them. "Well, ahem," said the rector suddenly from behind the two knights, entering the arena to address the crowd. "The boy has done it. He's successfully defeated the monster, but as you can see, he's—" began the rector. William suddenly leapt forwards towards the two knights with his spear raised in the air above him. Both Cain and August jumped backwards, narrowly avoiding William's spear as it penetrated the ground beneath them. "What are you—" August began to yell, before suddenly he heard it. A screech erupted from under the ground beneath William's spear, and the earth began to churn. A moor-crawler had been burrowing beneath their feet, and it had been mere inches away from reaching them. As William's spear pierced down through the ground and into the creature's back, it screamed, hurriedly bursting out of the ground and up into the arena. The rector cried out in horror, falling over backwards as he beheld the new threat that had appeared. The two knights readied themselves, standing defensively between the rector and the monster. William seemed to be assessing himself again, completely ignoring the moor-crawler, appearing to have considered this a simple test of his own strength. "Run!" exclaimed August without taking his eyes off of the new monster. The crowd seemed unsure of what to do, uncertain of whether this was all part of the show or not. The rector tried to scramble to his feet, but suddenly a hand erupted from under the ground, grabbing a hold of his ankle. "Richard!" shouted August. "On it!" said Cain, turning and dashing to the rector's aid. As the monster in front of August prepared to charge, William suddenly dived at it preemptively, slashing down at it with his longsword and pulling his spear from its back at the same time. August watched on in confusion as the boy, with half of his face missing and several clearly broken ribs, continued fighting as though he was unscathed. Suddenly screams began to erupt from the audience as more moor-crawlers began to burst up from the ground in the arena. Just where could they possibly be coming from, and how many would there be? Eric stood with his face pressed up against the bars, staring down at the scene unfolding in the arena. Multiple moor-crawlers were beginning to emerge from the ground. He could tell by a single glance at William that he'd lost his internal battle with Anne-Marie. If the smell of the tansies weren't enough on its own, the sadistic display had said it all. "Come on, Eric, we have to leave. It's not safe here," exclaimed Maud, reaching an arm out from within Gerald's protective grasp and pulling at Eric's robes. "But William is—" began Eric, before suddenly one of the moor-crawlers from down in the arena launched itself directly at him up in the stands. The second that it collided with the arena bars, they immediately came loose, toppling aside and leaving a clear opening between Eric and the moor-crawler. Eric fell backwards in surprise, and the audience began screaming, realizing that the crudely erected bars had never actually been keeping them safe at all. Despite scrambling for a moment as the bars fell away, the moor-crawler continued its attack, grabbing onto the edge of the stands and leaping straight at Eric's face with its arms outstretched. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Azalea dove between Eric and the monster, holding her shield up to knock it back before stabbing straight over the top and into its face, her bastard sword entering through the beast's mouth and exploding out of the back of its skull. With a gargled shriek, it fell back down into the arena. "Get up, Rothmane!" yelled Azalea commandingly. Immediately 2 more crawlers jumped up towards the gap in the bars from down in the arena, clinging onto the side of the stands and leaping up towards Azalea. "Dame Azalea!" began Eric, getting to his feet. "Run!" she exclaimed, crouching down to defend an attack from one of the crawlers, which crunched loudly against her shield. As Azalea stabbed back at the monsters, Eric heard screams erupt from behind him in the stands. He turned to look back, his mouth dropping with shock when he did. "Look out!" cried Eric, seeing a Maw-crawler hurrying over the stands, throwing people aside as it scrambled directly towards him. Eric grabbed Maud and Gerald, roughly pulling them back behind him as the Maw-crawler dove straight over the stands towards him. A crossbow bolt suddenly shot straight through the side of the Maw-crawler's head, interrupting its motion and causing it to be knocked down into the seats. The knight who had fired the bolt dropped her crossbow, pulled out a dagger and dived onto the flailing monster, driving her dagger straight through the side of its skull. "What's going on?" screamed Maud as she and Gerald tried to get back up onto their feet. Eric looked around at the scene surrounding them, his stomach dropping as realization set in. They were surrounded. The monsters weren't only coming from inside the arena, but outside too. Every single angle of the arena seemed to have more crawlers clambering over it, tearing people apart and engaging in brutal battles with knights scattered throughout the stands. It was a massacre. There was bloodshed and battle in all directions, as audience members were torn to shreds while the knights desperately tried to defend them. The terrified crowd had no safe direction to flee, trampling over one another in their attempts to find a safe place to run to, making things even worse. How had this happened, and what was he supposed to do here? Without warning, the battle that Azalea was locked in suddenly escalated, as yet another Maw-crawler burst up through the poorly constructed bars, sending them crashing down all around. One of the stray bars came barreling straight down towards Maud and Gerald. Gerald pulled Maud beneath him, taking the full brunt of the blow straight to his head. He immediately collapsed straight down onto the floor, completely unconscious. The monster dived at August, but he charged back at it defensively, holding his longsword above his head and slicing down as he slid under the monster, his blade slicing cleanly through the skull and even deep into the torso of the beast. He didn't have a moment to waste, however, as another Maw-crawler grabbed at his leg from the side. He continued his swipe downwards, slicing through the arm of the new Maw-crawler, which shrieked, jumping up at him with its remaining limbs outstretched aggressively. He spun around to face it, swiping back upwards in time to slice cleanly through the neck of his new attacker. "Behind!" yelled Kane, still locked in his own battle with multiple Maw-crawlers. August, still squatting down at this point, spun around, falling down onto his back and holding his sword upwards as yet another Maw-crawler dove at him from behind. As his sword pierced straight into its belly, he rolled over, pulling his sword out through the side of the monster's torso in the process. Now lying face down, a hand suddenly erupted from the ground beneath him, grabbing him by his neck and pulling him down into the earth. There was no angle for him to be able to reach the hand with his sword, so he let go of his blade, hurriedly reaching down for the dagger in his boot. The second that he managed to find its hilt, he brought it up to his throat and drew it straight through the wrist of the monster. There was a shriek from underground, and the grip around his neck immediately loosened. August reared back up onto his knees, throwing the hand aside and looking up as he gasped for breath. He suddenly saw that William was standing above him, staring down over him. Without breaking eye contact with August, William suddenly spun his spear around, placing it under his armpit and bracing himself so that the point of the spear extended up into the air behind his back. At that very moment, a Maw-crawler came flying at him, being struck in the face by the spear and shrieking in pain, tumbling off to William's side. William spun the spear back around and shoved it directly into the creature's neck, causing it to gargle blood, which erupted from its mouth. How was this boy fighting these creatures without even looking at them? How did he seem to know where they were before August did? Kane suddenly came flying down between the two of them, locked in a melee with a moor-crawler. He'd lost his sword at some point during the fight and now fought unarmed against the monster. As he landed beneath the moor-crawler, he reached up and grabbed it by the throat, squeezing tightly. With brute strength, he dug his fingers straight through a wound in the monster's flesh and clutched its esophagus, tearing it out through its throat and showering himself in blood. He threw the moor-crawler's body aside as August, too, got to his feet, extending a hand to help Kane up. Kane accepted his hand, suddenly looking over August's shoulder and launching straight back into action. He dove straight towards a moor-crawler which was encroaching on August from behind, punching it hard across the face, dislocating its jaw and sending it toppling down sideways. He immediately jumped on the creature, closing an arm around its neck and twisting abruptly, breaking its neck with an audible crunch. August cast his gaze to William, who was now standing in the middle of the arena with his eyes closed. He had a smile on his face as he breathed in deeply, seemingly drinking in the atmosphere. The moor-crawlers were avoiding him entirely now. As they scurried about, they kept a wide berth around him and never dared tread close. Just what was the darkness that lingered within that boy, and what kind of threat might it actually pose? William opened his eyes, looking around at the world of darkness that surrounded him. Where was he? At first he thought that he was completely shrouded by darkness, but then he noticed a single thin keyhole-shaped beam of light. He pressed his eye up against it, peering through. He immediately felt goosebumps run down his arms at what he saw. Through the keyhole he could see his bedroom, but something was different. The entire room was covered in enormous vein-like black tendrils which spiraled and spread their way over the floor, ceiling and every wall of the room. Between them extended a thick red glowing skin-like membrane that pulsated and crept over every inch of the room. Suddenly, an eyeball appeared in the keyhole, looking back through at him. William jumped back in shock. "You're locked in here with me now," whispered that disgusting, distorted voice that had been echoing in his mind when Anne-Marie had been sick. "Let me out!" demanded William, banging on the wardrobe door. He suddenly felt something slick and tendril-like wrap around his throat in the darkness. He reached for it, trying to pull away at it, but it was far too strong. Tendrils rubbed over every inch of his body in the darkness, tightening and binding around him firmly. "Let me out!" screamed William. "You will watch," whispered the voice as the tendrils pressed his face back up against the keyhole. The room through the keyhole began to swirl and change, now revealing the arena in the real world. It was in utter chaos. Knights fought with moor-crawlers in all directions as terrified townsfolk tried to flee, being torn apart by moor-crawlers and trampling one another in their futile efforts to escape. Each knight was outnumbered, trying their best to fight off the monsters but being unable to save everybody, while the moor-crawlers ripped apart the defenseless townsfolk. "Look," whispered the voice in William's ear. The view suddenly turned to look down at August and Kane, who were desperately trying to fight off 3 moor-crawlers each as both men began to run out of stamina. "Help them," begged William. "No," whispered back the voice, continuing to stand still as it watched the carnage escalating in the arena. One of the moor-crawlers suddenly got the better of Sir August, managing to grab one of his legs and pull it hard, bringing the knight crashing down onto the floor. "You told me that you'd kill them! You have to kill them!" screamed William desperately. "I've changed my mind," whispered back the voice, this time chuckling slightly with glee. Kane dove onto the back of the moor-crawler that had a hold on Sir August. He pulled a dagger out from his belt and began rapidly stabbing into the side of the throat of the moorcrawler, causing it to release its grip on Sir August as it began to gargle blood. "You said that you'd help them," screamed William again, watching as a moorcrawler jumped on Kane's back, pulling him away from Sir August. "I already tried that. It was boring. Their suffering is far too shallow. This is so much more fun," whispered back the voice. Before William could respond, the view suddenly tilted back up and around to face Eric. Through his monstrous eyes, William could see a moorcrawler creeping up the side of the arena beside Eric. All of the nearby knights were too distracted with their battles to have noticed it. "Stop it!" begged William desperately. The voice simply began to laugh as the moorcrawler drew closer. "You have to stop it," yelled William, pounding his forehead against the door of the wardrobe feebly. All he could do was look on helplessly at Eric, who had his back to William, huddled around something that he couldn't see. Why wasn't he running? Why was he just sitting there like a lamb to the slaughter? "Gerald!" cried Eric, shaking him to try and wake him up. "Oh no, please no," stammered Maud, staring into her husband's unconscious eyes. "I think he's just—" Eric stopped mid-sentence, suddenly hearing something behind him. He looked over his shoulder just in time to see the moorcrawler descending on him. "Quick! Get down!" cried Eric, pulling Maud on top of Gerald and covering both of them with his body. Instantly he felt a searing pain down his back as the moorcrawler slashed down at him with its inhuman strength, its fingers digging a gash across his back. He cried out in pain, but kept his guard over Maud and Gerald. "Eric!" screamed Maud. Eric shook his head and stayed where he was. He wasn't going to move. He needed to protect them, no matter what. William watched the brutal slash across Eric's back and screamed out in horror. "Stop! Please stop!" screamed William desperately as he watched the moorcrawler preparing for another attack, while the nearby knights were all too distracted to run to Eric's aid. The dark voice laughed, delighting in William's despair. What was Eric doing? Why was he just sitting there like that? The moorcrawler suddenly released another brutal slash with both of its front hands down on Eric, leaving enormous streaks of red exposed flesh down his back. Eric reeled back from the attack, being pulled up momentarily by the impact and screaming in pain, but that's when William noticed it. There, curled up beneath Eric, were Maud and Gerald. It was like William's world stopped for a moment as he stared open-mouthed at the scene, a whirlpool of emotions churning in his chest. Why were they here? Despite how much they worried about him and didn't want him to be in this stupid fight, they'd come anyway. They'd come all this way for William. They'd come here to support him, and they were going to die for it, just like his parents had, just like the gypsies had, and just like Eric was about to. Everybody who tried to support him died, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tendrils tightened once more, pressing his face hard up against the keyhole while its grotesque voice continued to chuckle at him. William felt his muscles beginning to tense up with fury. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. "This is my body," said William, closing his eyes as rage swelled in his chest. "This is my life," he continued, balling his fists up in the darkness of the wardrobe. "And I'm sick of watching you destroy it," continued William, his anger boiling over more and more as the faces of everybody this monster had hurt flashed before his eyes. Anne-Marie's laughing stopped, and she began breathing heavily. She ducked down, placing her eye up to the keyhole, looking in at him. "You let me in! I'm in control now. You've lost," said the monster furiously. "If I really let you in, then why is the key still in my pocket?" asked William, suddenly unleashing all of his might to break free of the tendrils in the darkness. Immediately, the creature in the dark released a blood-curdling shriek as William felt it flailing around behind him. He had to retake control. He had to. This was his body. This was his life. And it was time for him to take it back. He grabbed the key out of his pocket and began lifting it towards the keyhole. As the tendrils in the darkness once again began to wrap around him, he cried out with exertion, trying his hardest to raise his arm up. The monster continued squealing, while Anne-Marie paced back and forth outside the wardrobe furiously. William let out one final burst of rage and exertion, finally managing to rip his arm free of the tendrils. He slotted the key into the keyhole from the inside, twisting it roughly and feeling the telltale clack of the door unlatching. As soon as it did, he pressed up against it with all of his might, tumbling out and falling onto his corrupted bedroom floor. Anne-Marie immediately released an ear-piercing shriek, flying down towards him with her claws outstretched. William hurriedly got up onto his feet, reaching out and grabbing her by the neck preemptively. With another deafening shriek, she pierced all of her claws up through William's torso. The pain shot through every inch of his ethereal body, but he held on tight, grimacing through the agony as he managed to tighten his grip around her neck. As the two of them wrestled against one another, that familiar red mist started oozing back out of the wardrobe. "You fool! You've opened the door! Now you can never win!" screamed Anne-Marie in William's face, cackling maniacally as she gained strength from the red liquid-like smoke that was escaping the wardrobe and flowing into her. She used the invigoration to push William back, pressing him up against the far wall of his bedroom. He grunted with exertion, focusing with all of his might to keep his hands wrapped around her neck. "You're just a filthy parasite. This isn't your body. This isn't your life," screamed William, managing to push himself off from the wall and get some more ground, edging Anne-Marie back towards the wardrobe. "I won't let them die. I'll save them, no matter what it takes," cried William, continuing to press his position against the ever-growing strength of the monster before him. "Without me, you're dead. You only still breathe due to my power," screeched Anne-Marie, pressing back against William. "You think you're the one in control here? You think that you're the one keeping me alive?" asked William, pressing back against her with all of his might. "This is my body, and if I die, you die too." "That makes you my prisoner," yelled William, finally managing to push Anne-Marie all the way back against the wardrobe, slamming the doors shut behind her as he pressed her up against them. She shrieked, and so too did the red mist which was sealed back inside. It smashed against the inside of the wardrobe, banging and pounding furiously from within as William pressed Anne-Marie up against its doors, continuing to tighten his grip on her throat. "How?" she gasped, his grip now tight enough to be asphyxiating her. He slowly pressed her down until she was gagging for breath on the floor of his bedroom. He loomed over her, staring down hatefully into her eyes. "As long as you are in my body, you are my slave. Now you're going to help me save them, or I'll make sure we both die here together," said William with absolute conviction as he stared down into the monster's red eyes, which for the first time were filled with fear. "Rothmane!" screamed Azalea, wanting to run to his aid, but having a moor-crawler jump onto her back viciously at just that moment. She screamed with exertion, jumping backwards into the stands and crushing the creature against the chairs. As its grip faltered, she spun around, releasing a deft swipe from her sword, slicing its head clean off. As she once again started running towards Eric, another moor-crawler dove at her from the seats above her in the stands. She deflected it with her shield, turning around and following its trajectory down into a row of seats, stabbing down into its neck with her sword. She didn't waste a moment, continuing her momentum to spin back around to face Eric. She once again charged towards him, before a moor-crawler which had climbed its way up from the arena suddenly dove towards her, catching her by surprise and sending her crashing into the stands beside her. As the creature growled in her face, she managed to twist her blade up, screaming with exertion as she slid it up into the creature's belly. It shrieked in agony, releasing a hail of panicked blows down on her as it found itself impaled on her blade. She yelled out with exertion again, pulling the blade all the way up to its throat, gutting the beast above her and showering herself in its entrails. Its motionless body collapsed down over her, pinning her to the floor. She struggled as best she could beneath the creature, but it was too heavy for her to move. She looked through the carnage over at Eric desperately, just in time to see the moor crawler rearing up for one final blow. Eric was already barely conscious, losing huge amounts of blood down his back. There was no way that he would survive this next strike. He was doomed. Just as the moorcrawler was beginning its swipe down for its last attack, a spear suddenly flew up at an incredible speed, piercing straight through the back of the creature's head and exploding out the other side. Azalea looked down into the arena, seeing William standing there, somehow still conscious with half of his face missing and blood pooling on his chest. Despite all of this, he'd somehow managed to throw that spear in time to save Eric. The moorcrawler was dead before it hit the floor, collapsing down behind Eric as he too finally lost consciousness, still protecting Maud and Gerald beneath him. The crossbow-wielding knight from earlier suddenly appeared beside Azalea, helping her to flip the moorcrawler off of her and extending a hand to help her up. "Thank you, Maggie," exclaimed Azalea, accepting the helping hand before readying her shield and sword and looking around for the next moorcrawler. "I think that's the last of them up here for now," replied Dame Margaret, also looking around to see if there was anybody else left to save. Azalea cast her gaze down to the arena and her jaw dropped at what she saw. Cain and August were standing within a ring of bodies and carnage, with the rector cowering between them. They were both still locked in combat, with one final moorcrawler each. The two legendary knights had clearly lived up to their reputations, but they both looked utterly exhausted. Azalea noticed a third and final moorcrawler rearing up for an attack from behind August that he'd clearly not noticed. "August!" she yelled out desperately. Suddenly William, who had just picked up a longsword from the ground, swung it up from a weary fool's guard stance, overexerting himself and screaming with pain as his broken ribs were clearly crushed by the exertion. His blade just managed to pierce through the moorcrawler's torso enough to interrupt its attack. August spun around, stabbing down into the moorcrawler to finish it off before looking at William, who was beginning to stumble. The boy looked around, clearly searching for any more targets, and upon seeing none, collapsed roughly towards the ground. August just managed to catch him in time, lowering him down gently to rest. Azalea looked around the stands, searching for any remaining moorcrawlers. Up in the aristocrats section, it looked like Sir Ivar and Prince Alexander had managed to keep everybody safe, watching as Alexander beheaded the final moorcrawler that remained up there. All over the rest of the stands, knights were scattered throughout, having fought valiantly to protect as many of the audience members as they could. They were all still holding guard, searching for threats. A strange silence suddenly fell over the arena. For just a moment there was no screaming, no crying, and no sounds of combat. There was just an eerie silence as everybody collectively began to fathom that the battle was finally over. The silence remained for mere moments, however, as suddenly the survivors of the massacre collectively let their guards down, exploding with the pain and emotion of having faced such a harrowing situation. And with that, the combat trial concluded, as the knights began surveying the arena, searching through the survivors for the injured, and making sure that there were no remaining threats. Chapter 35. The Great Decision. "The king is furious," said the Duke, shaking his head as he looked out the window. "What am I to tell these people?" he asked, gesturing at the mob that had formed outside, awaiting the news from this important meeting. He looked around the room expectantly at the various knights and aristocrats who were gathered in the hall. "After seeing the performance of the knights, support for the college has never been greater, Your Grace," piped up the Chancellor, filling the awkward silence that had formed after the Duke's question. The Duke looked at him quizzically. "How does that help?" They want answers. Are you really telling me that none of you have even the slightest clue how this happened? Asked the Duke angrily, looking around at all of the highly ranked individuals who had played a part in the organization of the event. What say you, Kane? You're supposed to be an expert on these creatures. How could you have let this happen? Asked the Duke, raising his eyebrows at Kane. The intimidating behemoth of a knight stared back at him darkly, the fresh wounds on his face making him look even more imposing than usual. The Duke swallowed nervously, clearly too intimidated by the man to continue this line of questioning. One of the Viper Knights suddenly spoke up. We know that they couldn't have followed us here from the desert. These creatures are too afraid of sunlight to travel out in the open for all that way. They'd have never been able to keep up with us traveling only by night, they reported earnestly. Oh, please, where else could they have possibly come from? Asked the Duke. Somebody cleared their throats from the audience of aristocrats. Perhaps I can shed some light on that, Your Grace, said Viscount Terwin, standing up. For the past month we in the Bleaklands have been suffering from cattle mutilations, he began, looking around the crowd. After seeing the wounds inflicted by those monsters during the Bleaklands massacre, we believe that it was in fact these very same creatures that have been attacking our cattle, explained the Viscount. How could you have not come to me about this? Asked the Duke angrily. I did, Your Grace. You told me that a few dead cows were not worthy of your attention, defended the Viscount desperately. Pah! The Duke waved away the Viscount's claim without providing any counter-evidence. Ahem, there is a rather important matter to attend to, one to which the crowd outside are quite invested, said the Rector, standing up. The Duke let out a sigh. Yes, indeed. The boy, he said, sinking deep into thought. Considering the way that he behaved in that arena, I don't think that it would be appropriate for him to have a place in the college, said the Rector earnestly. The way he behaved? You mean saving lives, slaying monsters? What part of that doesn't sound knightly to you? Asked Dame Azalea, standing to her feet to defend William. Now, said the Duke, holding out a hand to restore order as the crowd began to murmur amongst themselves. The Lady Knight here does have a point. He has become somewhat of a hero to the survivors of the massacre. They all saw his inappropriate behavior during his trial, yes, but they also saw him slaying those monsters and saving lives. This is quite the divisive matter, and thus we must approach it delicately, explained the Duke. Who here has reason to speak against the boy becoming a squire? Asked the Duke, looking around the room. A few hands were raised. Beneath it all, he's still a commoner, a stable boy no less, exclaimed an angry aristocrat from the crowd, garnering some hums of agreement. Azalea elbowed Ivar expectantly. The lazy knight let out a sigh and rolled his eyes before standing up. Forgive me, but I thought the point of this trial in the first place was to decide whether he had a place in the college. Has that not already been decided by the result of the battle? He survived, the monster did not. As per the rules, that makes him a squire, does it not? Asked Ivar, looking around expectantly. First of all, began the Duke, looking down at Ivar, the king sends his regards for keeping his son safe. Your service will be rewarded duly, said the Duke, giving Sir Ivar a wry smile. A similar sentiment must be said for all of the knights who proved themselves worthy of their titles that night. You have proven why you are valuable, both to the crown and to the people of Oxgate, said the Duke, looking around at the knights who had valiantly fought against the monsters. Azalea and Ivar exchanged a triumphant glance with one another. At the very least, it seemed like the necessity for the college's taxes would no longer be under question. But, Sir Ivar, surely you see how the boy being a commoner complicates matters. Even if we say yes, what then? Are we to hold this event again for every gong farmer and chimney sweep from here to Castelia? Asked the Duke incredulously. The Rector nodded his head in agreement with the Duke. It goes without saying that this event cannot be held again. Speaking on behalf of the Great Library, I can tell you that we still don't even know what caused those monsters to rise up, or how long they've even been here. We don't know how many more there are, or whether they will attack again. All we know is that the trial itself somehow seemed to spur on this massacre. The timing and location are too aligned for it to be a mere coincidence. On those grounds alone, it must be abolished, exclaimed the rector. The crowd broke into a murmur of approving chatter. We all seem to be in agreement about this at the very least. Rector, please see that it be added to the college constitution that these trials may never be held again, decreed the Duke. The rector nodded in agreement, gesturing towards one of his aides, who ran out of the room quickly to do as he was told. So then, what of the boy? If he were to enter the college, what order would accept him? I have been told that the only order who even considered sending him an invitation after the written exam was the Order of the Destria, said the Duke, looking around the crowd searchingly. A knight stood up, bowing slightly as he entered the spotlight. On behalf of the Order of the Destria, we hereby rescind any offer which may have been presented to William Lackdorian. After recent events, we do not believe that he would be a good fit for our order, said the knight, bowing his head again before hurriedly backing into the crowd once more. Azalea sucked her teeth and rolled her eyes in response. The Duke looked down at her quizzically. Do you have something to say? Would you like to extend him an offer yourself? Do you believe that he would be a suitable fit for the Order of the Fox? Asked the Duke, raising an eyebrow. Azalea went to respond, but then sank deep into thought before letting out a defeated sigh. Your Grace, I must admit that William Lackdorian would be ill-suited for my order, said Azalea, looking down at the ground. The Duke nodded understandingly. How about you, Sir August? As I understand it, you fought side by side with the boy. From what I've heard, he may even have saved your life. He's demonstrated quite some prowess for combat, by far the most important factor for recruitment into your order. What say you? Asked the Duke, turning his attention to Sir August. The giant knight was uncharacteristically quiet, a dark expression plastering his face as he thought deeply about the question. He stood up, looking at the ground deep in thought. He began. He seemed to be struggling with his response. After a few moments, he let out a defeated sigh of his own. On behalf of the Order of the Lion, I too hereby decline an invitation to William Lackdorian. A talented fighter he may be, but he does not embody the qualities of our order, he finished, looking down regretfully. The Duke closed his eyes and nodded. Very well then. It would appear that even if we were to allow the boy enrollment into the college, a place for him does not exist. His atrocious exam scores exclude him from the majority of the more specialized orders, and he obviously lacks the lineage to enter the Order of the Drake, said the Duke, gesturing towards Sir Ivar. We could never send him to represent us in Castelia as a swan, nor does he have the specific skills to join the Order of the Wasp or the Lyre, said the Duke, looking over the room which was plunged into silence. He shrugged. Very well then. If there are no more objections, the boy will be denied a place within the college. He will not become a squire, nor will he, began the Duke. We'll take him, said a gruff voice suddenly, earning a surprised murmur from the crowd. The Duke scoured the room and raised his eyebrows when he saw who it had come from. Kane stood from his chair, raising his chin up to stare intently at the Duke. My boy will keep an eye on him. He'll keep him in line, said Kane assuredly. The Duke recoiled slightly in surprise for a moment before narrowing his eyes. Are you sure about this? Asked the Duke. Kane nodded his head decisively in response. The Duke let out a sigh. Are there any objections? Asked the Duke, looking around the room of disgruntled aristocrats. Despite the disapproving chatter that had broken out in the crowd, no one dared raise their hands against Kane's offer. Very well then, the boy will be extended an offer to join the Order of the Goat, Chancellor, "See to it that he receives it," said the Duke, looking at the Chancellor expectantly. The Chancellor bowed his head obediently, hurriedly whispering to his aide. "Then it has been decided. The boy will join the Order of the Goat," finished the Duke, looking around the room, which had erupted into divisive murmurs as the controversial Order of the Goat was brought into the limelight. Azalea and August gave each other a victorious glance, both thankful that William had found a place in the college, yet both filled with unease. Would it really be okay for him to be a squire? He had a lot of darkness in him, but also a lot of light. What kind of knight he became would depend entirely on the next few years of his life and how his talents were cultivated. Was the notorious Order of the Goat really the best place for him, or would they lead him even further astray? As the Duke continued on with the meeting, two questions lingered on everybody's minds. What kind of knight would William become, and would the goat make him, or would it break him? As the sound of a songbird chirping pulled him out of the depths of his slumber, William wearily tried to open his eyes, finding that only one would open. Panic spread through his body as he remembered where he was. He tried to sit up to look around the arena, immediately feeling searing pain spreading through his chest. He moaned in pain, but felt relief flow through him when he took in his surroundings. Rather than the arena, he was in some kind of hospital suite, the peaceful midday sun shining through his window as the shadows of the treetops outside danced around serenely on the windowsill. At the sound of a gasp from beside him, he craned his neck around to see who it had come from, feeling joy and relief spread through his entire body when he saw who it was. "You're awake!" exclaimed Eric from his bed on the other side of the room. He struggled to sit up, grimacing in pain as he did. "Hey, slow down!" croaked William, groaning slightly in pain himself from overexerting his broken ribs. The two boys chuckled at one another, both groaning with pain like old men. Eric sat up in his bed and slid his legs out from under the covers, standing up and beginning to make his way over towards William. "Hey, stay there! Your back is hurt," whispered William, remembering the horrendous attack the moor-crawler had unleashed on his friend. "It's nothing compared to what you've been through," said Eric, walking his way carefully over to William and sitting on the chair beside his bed. "How on earth are you even still alive?" asked Eric earnestly, casting his gaze over William's bandaged face and chest. William let out a sigh. "I think she somehow saved me. Or at least saved herself," said William, placing a concerned hand over his chest as he remembered the strange feeling that had come over him when he'd lost control. Eric suddenly raised a hand expectantly over him. William looked up at Eric with his one unbandaged eye and slowly raised his hand up to match Eric's before clasping it victoriously. "Hey," said Eric, looking down at him with a smile on his face. "It doesn't matter how, all that matters is that somehow we did it," he said earnestly, squeezing his hand and raising his eyebrows. William looked up at him quizzically, not sure of what exactly he meant. "Oh," said Eric, suddenly reaching into the pocket of his hospital robes and withdrawing a scroll. "Sorry, it came for you, but I couldn't resist," said Eric, handing the parchment to William, who held it up and tried to read it with his one uncovered eye. "The Order of the Goat?" asked William, putting the parchment down and looking at Eric quizzically. Eric nodded his head excitedly. "William, we're squires," said Eric excitedly. William lay back in his bed, speechless as the shock set in. They'd actually done it. Somehow they were squires. It had been a long and painful journey, but they'd actually done it. Suddenly, something occurred to him. He craned his neck back around to look at Eric. "Where's yours?" asked William. Eric let out a sigh and shook his head. "It's complicated," said Eric, looking down at the ground. "Surely you didn't actually fail that exam, did you?" asked William. "No, of course I didn't. It's just, I didn't get into the Order of the Owl," said Eric, avoiding William's gaze. "Well, don't tell me you're in the Order of the Goat too, whatever that is," croaked William, grimacing in pain from talking too much. Eric laughed and shook his head. "No, brother. I'm in the Order of the Drake," he said with a despondent sigh. William's head snapped back up to look at his friend in shock. "You mean that order that you said was only for the fanciest nobles?" asked William in surprise. Eric nodded before letting out another sigh and slumping his shoulders. "That's amazing," gasped William before groaning with pain again. "Just relax," said Eric, looking over William with concern. I hope I can get the answers we need. I don't know much about this order," said Eric, drifting off into thought. "Hey," said William, bringing Eric's gaze back to him. "We're squires," he said with a beaming smile. Eric grinned in response, nodding in agreement. "We did it," said Eric. "We did it," agreed William. A look of concern suddenly came across Eric's face. "And what about, Anne-Marie?" asked Eric, his expression darkening. William closed his eyes and shook his head. "She's gone," said William. Eric opened his eyes wide in surprise. "Gone?" asked Eric. "Without a trace," confirmed William, groaning with pain. A mixture of emotions came across Eric's face before he suddenly stood from his chair. "Sorry, Will, I shouldn't be making you talk so much. Try to get some more rest and heal up fast. We've got a lot of work to do. We're squires now, after all," said Eric with a wink, heading back over towards his bed. William smiled before turning away and staring at the far corner of the room where Anne-Marie stood, looking back at him from the shadows. "You lied to him," she said with a spiteful grin. William closed his eyes and tried to ignore her. Whether he liked it or not, he was stuck with her for now. All that mattered was that Eric was safe, and not only that, but they'd succeeded in their mission. The two simple farm boys had actually managed to become squires. Would they ever find the answers that they were seeking? Would they find out where these monsters had come from and what their plan was with William? Would he ever manage to rid himself of his insidious passenger? Their adventure was only just beginning, but as the sun shone its peaceful midday light through their hospital ward window, the boys relished in their victory so far, as short-lived as it may be. To be continued.